Windrush. What exactly was Windrush? Well, let's start there. The HMT Empire Windrush was a ship. She was originally called the MV Monte Rosa, and she was a German passenger ship launched in 1930. During the Second World War, she operated as a German Navy troop ship, but at the end of the war, she was taken as a prize of war by the British and renamed the Empire Windrush. So, what has a ship got to do with black people and why their lives matter? Well, after the destruction caused during the Second World War, Great Britain needed help to rebuild the country. There was a severe labour shortage in the UK after the war, especially in the transport network and the newly created National Health Service, so the NHS. So it was all hands on deck to rebuild the country, and extra bodies were needed to help. Now, at the same time, over 7,000 miles away in the Caribbean, lots of young men and women who had served in the British Armed Forces had returned home from war. At the time, many Caribbean countries were still under British rule and not yet independent. So when Britain went to war, their service was called upon to defend Britain, and by extension, the Empire. Following the war, in order to get more people to come and help rebuild the country, the British government actively invited people from what would become the Commonwealth to come and work. So some of these people answered an advert to come and work, others just wanted to see Great Britain, which they'd heard so much about. So where does the ship come in? Well, the Empire Windrush brought one of the first large groups of post-war West Indian immigrants to the United Kingdom, carrying 1,027 passengers and two stowaways on a voyage from Jamaica to London. The ship docked at the port of Tilbury near London on the 21st of June 1948. Now, at the time, housing in London was in short supply following the bombing that had taken place during the Blitz, and this led to some of the new West Indian arrivals facing hostility for taking homes and other forms of racism from Londoners who didn't want to live near black people. Predatory landlords charged Commonwealth citizens as much as double the rent of white residents in Notting Hill and crammed them into slum-like conditions. Windrush passengers without accommodation were temporarily housed by the government in Clapham South Deep Shelter, which was a disused air raid shelter 15 stories underground. The conditions were cramped and it was less than ideal, but it meant that many didn't end up homeless. Immigrants from the Commonwealth filled vacancies in vital industries, but faced a sometimes violent racist backlash from white British who felt they were stealing jobs. I should point out again at this point, the British government had advertised for these people to come to Britain specifically for these jobs. So at the top left, we have a picture of a ticket for the Empire Windrush. You can see it was to depart on the 23rd of May and it cost £48 or £28 depending on the class of ticket you had. Top right is the now famous shot of the passengers on deck as the ship docked at Tilbury. Down on the bottom left, we have a group of men disembarking from the ship. Next along, we have a small group of men reading a British newspaper. And bottom right, we have two ladies and a man in London also looking at something in the newspaper, quite possibly news stories about themselves, the new arrivals to the country. So why come to Britain? Most of us have seen the idyllic pictures of the Caribbean with its sunshine and beautiful beaches, so why leave all that behind to come to England? Well, the majority of the Caribbean islands had been underdeveloped by Britain since the abolition of slavery. There had been very little investment, and this had a knock-on effect to local economy, and the economy on most of the islands at the time was at crisis level, with high levels of unemployment and poverty. Coming to England, leaving behind everything they knew for a completely foreign and, as it turned out, quite hostile place, was more favourable of an option than given the alternative. Don't forget, many of the people who came over had previously been stationed in the UK as members of the armed forces during the war, and they had had good experiences. They'd made friends and they'd heard stories about what life was like in Britain. So when the opportunity arose, they made their way back. In 1948, the British Nationality Act gave the status of citizenship of the United Kingdom and colonies to all British subjects connected with the UK or a British colony. So some Caribbean migrants decided to make the most of their right as British citizens and came to the UK. As British subjects, many wanted to help rebuild Great Britain. They saw themselves as British and they saw their island homes as an extension of Britain, and they were proud to be British. Coming to the UK afforded West Indians opportunities and experience they simply never would have gotten on their islands. As previously mentioned, the British Nationality Act of 1948 gave citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies the right of settlement in the UK, and this right was given to anyone and everyone at the time who was a British subject by virtue of having been born in a British colony. Between the Act and subsequent encouragement from the British government campaigns in the Caribbean countries, this led to a wave of immigration from the West Indies. Between 1948 and 1970, nearly 500,000 people moved from the Caribbean to Britain, which, as previously mentioned, in 1948, Britain faced severe labour shortages following the Second World War. These immigrants were later referred to as the Windrush generation, named after the ship that had brought the first influx of immigrants from the Caribbean in 1948. Adults of working age and many children travelled from the Caribbean to join parents or grandparents in the UK, or they had travelled with their parents on their parents' passports and without their own. This was fully legal and quite common practice at the time. Since these people coming in had a legal right to come to the UK, they neither needed nor were given any documents upon entry to the UK. Why would they have been? They were travelling freely to a country of which they were a citizen. And following changes in immigration laws in the early 1970s, no documentation was provided by the government to these people. Many of them worked or attended schools in the UK without any official documentary record of their having done so, other than the same records as any UK-born citizen. Many of the countries from which the immigrants had come from became independent of the UK after 1948, and people living there became citizens of those countries. Legislative measures in the 60s and early 70s limited the rights of citizens of those former colonies, which were now members of the Commonwealth. It limited their rights to come and work in the UK. Anyone who had arrived in the UK from a Commonwealth country before 1973 was granted an automatic right to permanently remain, unless they had left the UK for more than 2 years. Since the right was automatic, many people in this category were never given documents or asked to provide documentary evidence of their right to remain at the time, or even over the next 40 years, during which many continued to live and work in the UK, believing themselves to be British. The Immigration and Asylum Act of 1999 specifically protected long-standing residents of the UK from Commonwealth countries from enforced removal. This provision was not transferred to 2014 immigration legislation because, according to the Home Office spokesperson, Commonwealth citizens living in the UK before the 1st of January 1973 were adequately protected from removal. In October 2012, when Theresa May was Home Secretary, before she became Prime Minister, she came up with the Hostile Environment Policy. The Hostile Environment Policy comprises administrative and legislative measures that make staying in the UK as difficult as possible for people without leave to remain, and this is in the hope that they may voluntarily leave. Theresa May stated that the aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants. Measures that were introduced by the policy include a legal requirement for landlords, employers, the NHS, charities, community interest companies, and banks to carry out ID checks and to refuse services if the individual is unable to prove legal residence in the UK. It also made landlords, employers, and others liable to fines of up to £10,000 if they failed to comply with these measures. Basically, the policy led to a more complicated application process to get leave to remain and encouraged voluntary deportation. Coincidentally, the policy happened to coincide with the sharp increase in Home Office fees for processing leave to remain, naturalisation and registration of citizenship applications. So the thing was, even if you did have the legal right to remain, if money was tight, you might struggle to afford the admin costs. From around 2013, so about a year after the Hostile Environment Policy came into effect, the Home Office received warnings that many Windrush generation residents were being treated as illegal immigrants and that older Caribbean-born people were being targeted. Also in 2013, Caribbean leaders had put the deportations on the agenda at the Commonwealth meetings in Sri Lanka. Caribbean governments told Philip Hammond, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, that immigrants who had spent most of their lives in the UK were facing deportation, and, at the time, their concerns were then passed on to the Home Office. Everything came to a head on the 14th of March 2018, when, during Prime Minister's questions in the House of Commons, opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn asked Theresa May, who was by this time the Prime Minister, about an individual who had been refused medical treatment under the NHS. Initially, Theresa May said that she was unaware of the case, but later agreed to look into it. Parliament thereafter continued to be involved in what was increasingly being referred to as the Windrush scandal. It emerged that in the years following the implementation of the hostile environment policy, many people from the Windrush generation had been wrongly detained, denied legal rights, threatened with deportation, and, in at least 83 cases, wrongly deported from the UK by the Home Office, despite being born British subjects and arriving in the UK before 1973. Many lost their jobs or homes or were denied benefits or medical care to which they were legally entitled as British citizens. So let's recap. The immigrants of the Windrush generation were invited by the British government to come to Britain to help to rebuild the country following the Second World War. When they arrived, they were treated poorly. They often faced increases in rent because of the colour of their skin. Many of the women became nurses. They worked for the NHS. They looked after the sick of a country that made them feel less than welcome, despite being invited to come to the UK by the British government. Many of the men had fought for Great Britain during the Second World War. They had risked their lives for a country that didn't welcome them, despite being invited to come to the UK by the British government. Great Britain still ruled many of the Caribbean islands and neglected to invest in those islands following the end of slavery. So many came to Great Britain as citizens seeking opportunities that they were being denied in the West Indies. The Windrush scandal saw many legal British citizens threatened with wrongful detainment and deportation following the institution of new government policy. Got it? Okay, let's move on.